And today we're talking about the role of China in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we're very happy to be joined for the conversation today by Carlos Martinez, an author and activist and co-founder of No Cold War and co-editor of Friends of Socialist China. Carlos, thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning, guys. Great to be with you again.
Well, it's great to have you back here, Carlos. And I feel like we've seen recently a considerable expansion and deepening of relationships between China and Latin America and the Caribbean. A lot of it through the Belt and Road Initiative, although China, in some cases, has had relationships with some of these countries for quite some time. I think of most recently, we've seen Cuba join the Belt and Road Energy Initiative. We've seen the resuming of diplomatic ties between China and Nicaragua, for instance. And, you know, when we talk about this region, Carlos, Latin America and the Caribbean, a part of the world whose history is marked by, the genocide of indigenous people, the enslavement of Africans, the exploitation of immigrant labor, and on top of all of that, the sort of colonial and imperial relationship that this region has had with the United States, with Europe, and with, the former colonial powers such as that. And even in speaking of the United States, of course, here, there was the Monroe Doctrine, which sort of functionally made Latin America and the Caribbean the quote-unquote backyard of the United States, sort of its colonial property. Now, here recently, we've, seen U.S. President Joe Biden say, well, actually, it's the front yard, as if that's some kind of promotion. But the question I wanted to really start with, Carlos, is, what is the character of this dynamic between China and Latin America and the Caribbean at this point? And how do we see it as different from what we've typically witnessed through the Monroe Doctrine sort of relationship?
Thanks, John. And that's a great question. And I think it's something that the world and including the left is really trying to grapple with, as we've seen the rise of Chinese engagement with Latin America over the last 20 years in particular. How is this different to the West's engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean over the centuries? And a lot of this comes down to trying to negate and combat this concept of neither Washington nor Beijing, right? It means refuting the idea that China is the new imperialist power in Latin America, that China seeks domination or hegemony. As you say, the West record is, I think, pretty reasonably well understood. European colonialism put the land, the resources, the labor, the markets of Latin America and the Caribbean at the service of the European colonial powers. And then with the Monroe Doctrine and the rise of US imperialism, really the overall dynamic hasn't changed very much in the post-colonial era. Europe's role has been taken over by the US, which has become accustomed to having, either a backyard or a front yard, as you say, that it can dominate, that it owns. Now, in the last 20 years, China's economic engagement with Latin America has gone from sort of almost nothing to really quite a lot. I think bilateral trade's increased 30 times since 2000. Foreign direct investment from China's gone up by a factor of 5 or so. And you've got 2/3 of the countries in the region that have already signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative. And literally, billions of dollars worth of infrastructure projects have been undertaken or are in the works. So, people ask, is this just Chinese imperialism taken over, sort of muscling in on US imperialism? And, but I suppose partly we've got a definitional issue here, like what is imperialism? Some people, I guess, on the basis of speed reading Lenin, think that imperialism is just when you've got some large companies, some monopolies, or when a country is engaged in the export of capital. But actually, in a modern economy, by that definition, most of the countries in the world are imperialist countries, right? Anti-imperialists might as well be calling for the liberation of Portugal from Angolan imperialism, because there's a couple of big Angolan state-owned companies that invest in Portugal. Obviously, that's ridiculous. But it highlights that what imperialism is about is domination. It's about establishing formal or informal empires. If you look at, say, the IMF's structural adjustment programs, the Washington Consensus, neoliberalism, forcing these countries in the global south to open up their economies to exploitation, privatization, deregulation, deunionization, and so on. That's what modern imperialism looks like. And it's backed up with economic coercion, i.e. sanctions and destabilization. It's backed up with physical coercion, coups, wars, proxy wars, military bases. So we've got a clear picture of what imperialism looks like in reality. And the question is, we know what that's what the US is doing, and we know what that's what a handful of countries in Western Europe are doing. Is China doing that? If you believe Hillary Clinton or Rex Tillerson or Antony Blinken, then yes, China is the new colonial power in Latin America. But the reality doesn't match that. China offers trade and investment, and these are things that the countries of the region need. Chinese loans, Chinese investment aren't conditional on imposing austerity or imposing privatization. They don't come with strings attached. And China's it's always been very careful to deal with other countries on the basis of non-interference and respect for their sovereignty. And all it demands in return is that its sovereignty be respected too. China's got no military bases in Latin America, literally zero. It's organized literally zero coups in Latin America. It's waged no proxy wars in Latin America. It's engaged in no destabilization campaigns, imposed no sanctions. Whereas the US has led or supported coups in, it's a long list: Guatemala, Brazil, Chile, Venezuela, Bolivia. It's conducted a vicious 10-year proxy war in Nicaragua. It's imposed a 6-decade embargo on Cuba. China's done none of that. China's just investing in the things that Latin America needs: infrastructure, trains, roads, housing, digital technology, telecoms, satellites, green energy. And this economic relationship is evolving as well. Up to around 10 years ago, it was very focused on primary commodities because the prices were very high, and Latin American countries did very well out of selling raw materials to China. So an obvious example of that is Venezuela, where, Venezuela is a very oil-rich country. It was selling oil at high prices to China, and on that basis, financing its social programs. But now the investment focus is much more about upgrading economies, advancing industrialization, shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and so on. So really, this bears no resemblance whatsoever to anything that you could reasonably call imperialism.
Carlos, some people will hear that and say, yeah, but China isn't doing this for free. They're not investing in Latin American countries or anywhere else in the world where the Belt and Road Initiative is expanding and being accepted. China's not doing any of this out of the kindness of their heart. So, of course, there is a benefit to China from the trade angle of this, where they are able to profit from trade with these countries, and they are offering loans where there is, some type of benefit to China as the one who is offering, as the entity that is offering the loans. I mean, they're not zero interest loans, even if they don't condition the loans on, the government of Latin American countries imposing privatization schemes and neoliberal policies or having any input in their governments politically. I mean, but there are people who will hear this and say, well, look, China is still benefiting from this, so they're not doing this from the kindness of their heart. So, I mean, what would you say to people who just insist upon seeing China as an unequal actor here with nefarious intentions, as opposed to, probably as honest an actor on the global economic stage as we can expect in the modern era?
Yeah. Thanks, Jacquie. That's a great question. Absolutely. China is engaged in these projects fundamentally as a business relationship. It's trying to reap rewards from its investment, which is very normal. And actually, there has been a shift in Chinese kind of global policy and diplomatic relations with other countries away from aid, which it's found to be kind of unsustainable, to a mutually beneficial trade relationship. And that, that's a very reasonable thing to demand and to expect from an economic relationship between two countries, is that it should benefit both sides. And that's what China's really trying to promote. And you've got to remember as well, China's still a developing country. China's per capita GDP is something along the lines of $11,000-12,000 per year now, which is pretty similar level to most of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, actually. So it's not like China's this big, economic superpower that's in an unequal relationship with these countries in Latin America. Obviously, it's bigger by virtue of having a bigger population, but it's not that the average Chinese person is living so much better than the average person in Colombia or Chile or Venezuela. Yes, the loans are not zero interest, but they are, very importantly, much lower interest than the equivalents from the international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. And they don't come with conditionalities, which is essential. I mean, we've got this debt trap narrative that the Western media absolutely loves talking about in relation to China. And sure, taking out loans is by its very nature risky because loans mature and have to be paid back. Investments are capitalized. So what happens if things don't work out as predicted? But, it's kind of ironic, this whole narrative, because it's precisely the Western multinationals that have pioneered the debt trap and have used it throughout the post-colonial era as a means of creating a neo-colonial relationship with the countries of the global South. The experience in reality of pretty much every country that's taken out Chinese loans has been that the loan terms are much less onerous than Western loans, and that also Chinese lending institutions are typically very flexible, very pragmatic when it comes to renegotiating debt, writing debt off where necessary, and so on. So at the start of the pandemic, lots of countries that, like the least developed countries, the lowest income countries that had debt to China, had their debt written off. So there's all of these scare stories, but none of them actually turn out to be true. There was a big thing in the press recently about China taking over a new airport in Kampala in Uganda because the Ugandans couldn't pay off the loan. And it just turned out to be complete fake news. The Ugandan government literally had to release a statement saying it was fake news. But as is so often the case, the accusation is front page news and the retraction is practically invisible. We don't have to rely on speculation. Actually, we don't have to make up stories. We can look at the reality from 20 years of this expanding economic relationship between China and Latin America and the Caribbean. China's lent huge sums of money to Venezuela, a country which has gone through a lot of difficulties in the last 10 years due to changes in the global oil market, but more importantly due to US interference, sanctions and destabilization. Has China taken over the PDVSA, the Venezuelan state oil company? Has it seized Venezuelan assets or compromised Venezuelan sovereignty? It hasn't. China and Venezuela continue to have excellent state-to-state relations. The CPC and the PSUV continue to have excellent party-to-party relations, and trade and investment and this mutually beneficial relationship continues to this day. A similar story can be said about Bolivia, Nicaragua, Argentina, other countries. So, and just this is kind of slightly controversial, but I think there's a bit of an element of racism in this whole narrative that you've got these cynical and cunning Chinese that are hoodwinking the Africans and the Caribbeans and the Latin Americans who are kind of a bit naive and not terribly clever, and they need white saviors in the US and Europe to save them from themselves. Ultimately, yes, it's the Belt and Road Initiative and the expanding relationship between China and Latin America and Africa and the Caribbean and other parts of the developing world. It's not an aid relationship. It's a trade relationship. But the idea is that it should be mutually beneficial and that it should be win-win.
Definitely. And I couldn't agree more that there's absolutely some racism involved here, which, is itself, I think, a remnant of that sort of colonial and imperial thinking.